I found out my father left everything to me 3 years after he died. And the only reason I found out at all was because of a parking ticket. I need you to sit with that for a second because I did. A parking ticket. Not a lawyer calling me. Not my mother sitting me down at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes and a folder of paperwork. A $10 late fee on a storage unit I didn't know existed. Mailed to an address I hadn't lived at in 6 years. Forwarded 3 times before it finally landed in my mailbox on a Tuesday in March. My name was on the account. Not my mother's. Not my brother's. Mine. I stood in my kitchen holding that envelope for a long time before I opened it, because something in my chest already knew this was going to change everything, and some stubborn, tired part of me wanted just one more minute of not knowing. My name is Rachel. I was 34 years old when that envelope arrived, and I want to walk you through exactly how I went from being the daughter my family quietly, politely, almost lovingly erased, to the woman who sat across from her mother in a lawyer's office and watched her realize in real time that the lie was over. But to understand why that storage unit mattered, you have to understand what it was like to be me in that family for the 3 years before it. My father, David, died on a Thursday in October. He'd had a bad heart for years, the kind of thing doctors warn you about, and you nod and you keep eating what you want to eat anyway because you're 61 and you feel invincible in the particular way that men who built something from nothing often feel invincible. He built a small chain of hardware stores across 2 counties, 3 locations, decent income, nothing extravagant, but enough that when he died there was a house, some savings, the stores themselves, and apparently, though I didn't know it yet, quite a bit more than that. I was his only daughter. I had one brother, Marcus, 2 years older than me, golden in the way older sons in families like mine are often golden, not because he did anything spectacular, but because he showed up to things and smiled at the right times and never asked hard questions. My mother, Diane, remarried within 14 months of my father's death, to a man named Gary who I'd met exactly 4 times before the wedding, a man who talked about my father's stores like he already had ideas about how they should be run differently. At my father's funeral, I remember standing near the casket and feeling like a guest at my own family's grief. My mother cried beautifully, the kind of crying that draws people toward you to comfort you rather than the ugly, silent kind that makes people look away. Marcus gave a eulogy that made 3 separate people tell me afterward how close he must have been with Dad. And I stood there thinking about the last real conversation I'd had with my father 6 weeks before he died, in the back office of the store on 5th Street, where he'd looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "You're the only one who ever asks me how the business is actually doing instead of how much it's worth." I didn't think much of that sentence at the time. I think about it every day now. The will was read 2 weeks after the funeral in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, with a lawyer named Harold Whitfield who I'd never met before, who my mother had apparently hired the year before my father died, though nobody explained that detail to me until much later. According to that will, the house went to my mother. The business, all 3 stores, went to Marcus to be managed jointly with my mother as an advisor. And I received $12,000 and my father's old fishing boat, which had a cracked hull and hadn't been in water in 4 years. I remember sitting in that conference room feeling the air leave my lungs slowly, not all at once the way it does in movies, but in this quiet, humiliating trickle. I remember my mother reaching over and patting my hand and saying, "Your father always said you were independent. He knew you'd land on your feet." I remember Marcus not looking at me at all. I want to be honest with you. I didn't fight it. I signed what I needed to sign. I told myself that money isn't love, that my father showing his love in unequal dollar amounts didn't erase 31 years of him teaching me to change a tire in the parking lot of store number 2, of him calling me every single Sunday just to ask what I was reading, of him being the only person in my family who came to my art shows in college even though nobody bought anything and the wine was bad and the gallery was really just a converted garage. I told myself the will was just paperwork, and paperwork isn't the truth of a person. But something didn't sit right. It sat wrong in a low, quiet way for 3 years, the way a splinter sits wrong under skin that's already healed over it. Because my father was careful. My father was, above almost anyone I've ever known, a careful, precise, deliberate man. He balanced his own books by hand even after the stores got software for it, because he said he trusted his own eyes more than a screen. He wrote things down. He kept records of records. And the will that Harold Whitfield read to us in that conference room felt like it had been written by someone who didn't know my father at all, someone who thought independent was a kind word to leave a daughter with $12,000 and a broken boat. I want to tell you about the years between the funeral and the parking ticket because they matter even though nothing dramatic happened in them. I got married during those years to a good, steady man named Josh who works in city planning and who noticed, before I did, that I flinched every time my mother's name came up. I had my daughter, Emma, during those years too, and I remember holding her in the hospital and thinking about how my father would have driven 2 hours in the middle of the night just to see her, because that's who he was with babies, ridiculous and soft and completely undone by them. My mother saw Emma 4 times in her first year of life. Marcus saw her twice. I kept working. I'm a physical therapist and I built a decent practice slowly over those years, the kind of slow that doesn't make for an exciting story but does make for a stable one. I didn't ask my family for anything. I told myself I'd made peace with the will. I want you to understand that when I say I told myself that, I said it out loud to Josh at least once a month, the way people say things they're still trying to convince themselves of. There were small moments during those years that I filed away without understanding I was filing them away. My mother mentioning, almost in passing, that the store on 5th Street had changed hands a little in how it was managed, and me not asking what that meant because I didn't think it was mine to ask about anymore. Marcus showing up to my birthday dinner in a car I didn't recognize, newer than anything he'd driven before, and nobody mentioning it, the way families sometimes agree without ever discussing it to simply not mention certain things. My mother's house getting a new roof, new landscaping, a kitchen renovation with the kind of countertops I remembered her admiring in magazines for years, and never being able to afford when my father was alive and careful with money. I noticed all of it. I just didn't let myself add it up because adding it up meant asking questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to, and some quiet, self-protective part of me had decided that peace, even a manufactured, uneasy peace, was better than confirmation of something I couldn't undo. I told Josh once during that stretch that I thought grief made you generous in strange ways, that maybe I was just supposed to let this version of unfairness go the way you let go of a parent's favorite chair or their handwriting on old birthday cards. He didn't argue with me. He just held my hand a little tighter than usual, in the way he does when he thinks I'm telling myself something I don't actually believe. And then the parking ticket came. I opened the envelope standing in my kitchen with Emma napping upstairs and Josh at work, and inside was a notice from a storage facility 40 minutes outside the city, informing David R. Hensley's estate, care of Rachel Hensley Cole, that Unit 214 had an outstanding balance of $41, and that failure to pay within 30 days would result in the contents being sold at auction. My father had been dead for 3 years. I had never heard of this storage unit, and my name, not my mother's, not my brother's, was listed as the responsible party. I called the facility that same afternoon, my hands actually shaking as I dialed, and a bored young man named Kevin confirmed that yes, the unit had been rented under my father's name 8 months before he died. And yes, I was listed as the secondary contact, and no, he couldn't tell me what was inside. Only that the account had been on autopay from a bank account that had apparently closed 6 months ago, which was why the payments had lapsed and the late notice had finally been triggered. I paid the $41 over the phone. And then I sat down on my kitchen floor, because my legs didn't feel like they wanted to hold me anymore. And I asked Kevin the question that changed everything. Can I come see what's in there? I drove out the next morning before Josh even left for work, telling him only that I needed to run an errand because some part of me, some old, tired, protective part of me, didn't want to say the real reason out loud yet, didn't want to make it real by speaking it. The storage facility was one of those long orange buildings off a highway exit, the kind you drive past 100 times without ever really seeing. Kevin buzzed me in, walked me down a row of identical metal doors, and left me alone at Unit 214 with the key that had been sitting in an unclaimed items drawer since the account went delinquent. I stood there for almost a full minute before I lifted the door. Inside was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, honestly. Boxes, maybe. Old furniture. What I found instead was a single gray filing cabinet, a wooden chest I recognized instantly because it used to sit at the foot of my parents' bed when I was a kid, and a sealed manila envelope taped to the top of the filing cabinet with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. Not to my daughter. Not to whoever finds this. My name. Rachel. I want to tell you that I opened it right there, but I didn't. I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit with that envelope in my lap and I cried hard, the kind of crying I hadn't let myself do at the funeral, because for 3 years I had believed, quietly and completely, that my father's last message to me in dollar terms was that I was worth $12,000 and a broken boat. And here he was 3 years later, having apparently left me something else entirely, something he'd hidden well enough that even a parking ticket had barely uncovered it. When I finally opened the envelope, there was a letter inside, handwritten, for pages, dated 11 days before he died. I'm not going to read you every word of that letter, because some of it is mine and mine alone. But I'll tell you what it said because it's the reason everything after this happened the way it did. My father wrote that he had changed his will 4 months before his death, quietly, without telling my mother, using a different lawyer than the one she trusted, a woman named Patricia Nguyen whose card was paperclipped to the second page. He wrote that he'd watched over the last several years of his marriage my mother and Gary, and yes, he knew about Gary, he knew about the affair long before he died, which was its own gut punch of a revelation, quietly positioning themselves around the business and the estate in ways he didn't trust. He wrote that Marcus had asked him for money 4 separate times in the 2 years before his death and that each time, my mother had defended Marcus and criticized my father for even hesitating. And he wrote that I had never once asked him for anything. He wrote that the will Harold Whitfield read in that conference room was real, but it was not final. He wrote that he'd left the amended will, along with financial records going back 6 years, with Patricia Nguyen, and that he'd left copies along with this letter, in this storage unit as a backup because, and this is the sentence that undid me completely, your mother is a careful woman, Rachel, and I don't trust careful women who married me for comfort not to find a way around anything I put only in one place. He left me the business. All 3 stores. 60% of the estate. My mother was to keep the house and a fair settlement, and Marcus was to receive a trust with conditions attached. Money released over time rather than all at once because, in my father's words, he's not ready to hold that much at once and I love him too much to hand him a gun. I sat on that concrete floor for almost 2 hours. The filing cabinet, once I finally opened it with a key taped inside the wooden chest, held 6 years of financial records, bank statements, tax filings, and a ledger my father had kept by hand, the same way he balanced the stores, documenting money that had moved out of joint accounts and into accounts under Gary's name in the 18 months before my father died. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Then, for months before his death, a single transfer of $83,000, routed through an account that, based on the statements, my mother had opened without my father's name on it at all. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds and I promise you I felt the same disbelief you might be feeling right now. I didn't want it to be true. Some small loyal part of me spent that entire drive home trying to construct an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a loan. Maybe my father had approved it and just never told anyone. Maybe I was about to blow up my entire family over a misunderstanding. I didn't say anything to anyone for 6 days. I told Josh, of course, that night, sitting at our kitchen table with the manila envelope between us like something radioactive. He read the letter twice, quiet the whole time, and then he asked me the only question that mattered. What do you want to do? I told him I wanted to know the truth before I did anything. Not revenge. Not a lawsuit. The truth. I called Patricia Nguyen the next morning, my hands shaking again as I dialed a number I found on a business card that was 6 years old, half expecting it to be disconnected. It wasn't. She remembered my father immediately, remembered him with a warmth in her voice that made my throat tighten. And when I explained who I was and what I'd found, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I wondered if anyone would ever call, she said. I've had his file sealed in a drawer for 3 years, Rachel. I'm so glad it's you. She told me that my father had, in fact, executed a new will 4 months before his death. Fully valid, properly witnessed, notarized, the whole process done correctly and quietly. She told me she tried to reach my mother's lawyer, Harold Whitfield, twice in the weeks after my father's death, once by phone and once by certified letter, informing him that a superseding will existed and requesting the estate proceedings be paused. Both times, according to her records, she received no response. She told me she'd assumed, after a year of silence, that the family had somehow reached a private settlement, because that happens sometimes, and it wasn't her place to pursue it further without a client asking her to. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the storage unit. Did my mother know about this will? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Rachel, she said, your father's amended will named your mother as a required party to be formally notified of its existence upon his death. I have the certified mail receipt. It was signed for at your mother's address 11 days after the funeral. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. My mother had known. Not suspected, not guessed. Known with a signature and a date that my father had left the business to me, and she had said nothing for 3 years, while I sat across from her at Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties, while she patted my hand in that conference room and told me my father knew I'd land on my feet, while she remarried a man who had, according to my father's handwritten ledger, been quietly funneled $83,000 before my father's heart even stopped. I didn't confront anyone that week. I want you to understand why, because I think it matters. I wasn't protecting my mother. I was protecting myself. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I said a single word, because the moment I said something, I knew there would be no taking it back, no pretending I didn't know, no more quiet Thanksgivings where I could tell myself the unfairness of that conference room was just an old wound I'd learned to live with. So instead, I did something my father would have understood completely. I got organized. Over the following 3 weeks, working mostly at night after Emma was asleep, I built a folder. Not a metaphorical one. An actual folder, then a second one, then a small accordion file that eventually became so thick I had to buy a second one. I had Patricia and Gwen send me certified copies of the amended will and the signed notification receipt. I pulled property records showing that the house my mother lived in, the one that was supposed to be hers under both wills, had a new second mortgage taken out against it 8 months after my father died, for a sum that matched almost exactly the amount Gary had put down as a personal investment in a boat dealership that, according to public business filings, existed for 11 months before folding. I requested, through Patricia, formal copies of the store's financial statements for the 3 years since my father's death, which I was legally entitled to as a named beneficiary under the amended will, whether Marcus liked it or not. What I found there was its own quiet devastation. Under Marcus's management, with my mother advising, the store on 5th Street, the one where my father used to work the register himself some Saturdays just to talk to regulars, had lost money for 2 straight years. Inventory had been sold off at what looked like personal discretion rather than business need. There were 4 separate cash withdrawals over $11,000 each, logged only as owner draw, with no further documentation. My father built those stores over 22 years. In 3 years without him, they were being quietly hollowed out by people who had never once had to build anything themselves. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at nearly 1 in the morning, going line by line through those financial statements with a highlighter in one hand and a cold cup of tea in the other, and feeling something shift in me that I can only describe as grief turning into resolve. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was quieter than that, more like the feeling of watching water slowly find a crack in a foundation and understanding, with total clarity, that the crack was always going to widen whether I looked away from it or not. I printed everything. I labeled everything. I built a timeline on a sheet of poster board I taped to the wall of my home office, dates on one side, dollar amounts on the other, because my father was a man who trusted numbers written down more than promises spoken aloud, and I found myself, without quite deciding to, becoming exactly that kind of person too. I also went back through old text messages I'd nearly forgotten I still had, conversations with my mother from the months after the funeral, casual, ordinary messages about nothing in particular, a recipe she wanted to send me, a question about Emma's due date. Reading them again with what I now knew felt like watching a home movie, and suddenly noticing a stranger standing in the background of every frame. She had been so normal, so warm even. The whole time she was sitting on a signed receipt that told her exactly what my father wanted for me. She was asking me if I needed help picking out a stroller. I also found, tucked in the back of that gray filing cabinet, something I hadn't expected. Photographs. Dozens of them, printed from a phone, dated the year before my father died, showing Gary and my mother together at a lake house I'd never heard of, at a restaurant 2 towns over, in what was unmistakably an embrace that had nothing to do with 2 people who were just friends from the club, which is what my mother told people Gary was, right up until the wedding 14 months after the funeral. My father had known. He had known for at least a year before he died, and instead of blowing up his marriage in front of his children, he had quietly, carefully, built a paper trail and rerouted his legacy to the one person he trusted not to spend it on someone else's boat dealership. I think about that a lot. How my father spent his last months protecting me with paperwork instead of confrontation. How much that tells you about who he was, and how much it told me about what I needed to do next. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I know some of you watching this are waiting for me to storm into a family dinner with a folder under my arm and slam it on the table. That's not what happened, and I think that's important. My father didn't raise a person who does that, and honestly, I don't think that version of the confrontation would have gotten me anything except a louder version of the same 3 years of being erased. My mother is very, very good at making herself the victim in a room full of raised voices. I wasn't going to give her that room. Instead, I called Harold Whitfield's office directly. I identified myself, told him I had documentation of a superseding will, and that I had proof his office had received formal notification of it, and asked very calmly whether he wanted to discuss this professionally or whether he'd prefer I discuss it with the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee first. He went very quiet on the phone, and then he asked if I could come in. That meeting 3 days later is where everything started moving for real. Harold Whitfield is not, I think, a fundamentally corrupt man. I think he's a man who has known my mother for a long time, who liked her, who received a phone call from her 11 days after my father's funeral telling him there was some confusion about an old draft will that didn't reflect my father's real wishes, and who, rather than doing his due diligence, chose to believe a grieving widow he'd known for 15 years over a certified letter from a lawyer he'd never met. I think he made a mistake born of comfort and familiarity rather than malice, and when I sat across from him with Patricia Nguyen's documentation spread on his desk, I watched him understand in real time exactly how serious that mistake was. He didn't fight me. He couldn't. The paper trail was too clean, too dated, too notarized. Within 2 weeks, with Patricia now formally representing the estate, a probate attorney filed a motion to reopen the estate proceedings based on newly discovered evidence of a valid superseding will. I want to skip past most of the legal mechanics here because I know they're not what you're here for, but I'll tell you that it took 4 months, that it involved a forensic accountant tracing the $83,000 transfer and the second mortgage and the boat dealership investment, and that at the end of it, the court's findings were not ambiguous. The amended will was valid. It should have governed the estate from the beginning. And there was, in the accountant's careful words, a pattern of financial conduct inconsistent with the fiduciary responsibilities my mother had assumed as executor of an estate she knew, from day 11, was not hers to execute. But before any of that became public before lawyers and courtrooms, I did something I'd been planning since the night I read my father's letter at my kitchen table. I asked my mother to meet me alone. Not at her house. Not at a family dinner. I asked her to meet me at the store on 5th Street on a Sunday morning before it opened, the same store where my father used to work the register, where I still had a key because I'd never given it back, some stubborn part of me holding on to it for 3 years without understanding why. She showed up looking exactly like herself, put together, a little wary, the way she always looked when she suspected I wanted to talk about something serious and had already decided in advance she wasn't going to give me the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't yell. I want to be really clear about that, because I think the temptation in a moment like that is enormous. 3 years of quiet humiliation sitting right behind your teeth, ready to come out loud. I didn't do that. I set the folder on the counter, the same counter my father used to lean on while he talked to customers about paint colors and gutter systems, and I opened it to the first document, the certified mail receipt with her signature on it, dated 11 days after the funeral. I need you to look at this, I said, before you say anything. I watched her face while she read it. I want to tell you I felt triumphant, but honestly what I felt was sad, this heavy, exhausted sadness watching my mother's expression move through recognition, then something that might have been shame, then, faster than I expected, something that hardened back into control. Rachel, she said, your father was not thinking clearly at the end. That will doesn't reflect. He wrote me a letter, I said, and I put that on the counter too. 4 pages. 11 days before he died. Do you want to read it? Or do you want me to read you the part where he wrote that he already knew about Gary? She didn't say anything for a long time. I laid out the rest of it methodically, not as an accusation but as a fact pattern, the way I imagine a good lawyer would, because at that point I'd spent weeks learning to talk like one. The second mortgage. The boat dealership investment. The $83,000 transfer with a timestamp 4 months before my father's death. The 4 cash withdrawals from the store logged only as owner draws. I told her Patricia Nguyen was already representing the estate, that the probate motion had already been filed, that a forensic accountant already had copies of everything in that filing cabinet, and that none of what happened next was actually up to her anymore. And then I told her what I wanted, which surprised her, I think, more than the paper trail did. I didn't want to destroy her. I didn't want Marcus prosecuted, though the accountant's report certainly gave grounds for someone to consider it. I told her I wanted the estate to be restructured according to my father's actual wishes, 60% of the business to me, a fair and honest accounting of what remained after 3 years of mismanagement, the trust for Marcus reinstated with its original conditions rather than the informal access he'd apparently been granted instead. I told her I wanted her to keep the house because my father had wanted that too, and because I am not a person who wants to watch my mother lose her home whatever else she'd done. And I told her that I was never going to bring this up at another family dinner, never going to hold it over her, never going to make Emma grow up hearing her grandmother's name spoken with contempt. But I also told her that the version of our relationship where I quietly accepted whatever she decided to tell me about my own father's wishes was over, permanently, starting that morning. She cried in that store, the real kind this time, not the funeral kind. She told me she'd panicked 11 days after the funeral, holding a piece of paper that would have handed her husband's entire legacy to the child she'd always, in her words, understood less. And that Gary had told her it would be easier for everyone if the original will just stood. That families fell apart over things like this, that I would be fine, I'd always been fine on my own. I told her that being fine on my own for 3 years hadn't been a compliment. It had been a decision she made for me without telling me, so that I wouldn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. I left the store that morning without another word from her because I'd said everything I needed to say, and I understood, standing there, that I wasn't going to get an apology that meant anything, not that day, maybe not ever, and that I needed to be okay with that before I walked in there because I was never going to get closure from her. I was only ever going to get the truth, and the truth, it turned out, was enough. The probate court finalized the amended will's authority 5 months after that morning in the store. I became majority owner of my father's 3 stores. I kept Harold Whitfield out of it entirely after that, working instead with Patricia, who I still work with today, who became, in a strange and lovely way, something like the professional extension of my father that I hadn't known I needed. Marcus's trust was reinstated with its original conditions, and to his credit, once the dust settled, once he was no longer operating with unrestricted access to money that wasn't fully his, he actually came to me quietly and asked if he could keep working at the 5th Street store, not managing it, just working there the way our father used to some Saturdays, talking to regulars about paint colors. I said yes. I don't know if that makes me generous or just tired of losing family members to money. Maybe both. My mother kept the house. Gary did not stay long after the accounting became public within certain circles of people who mattered to my mother's sense of standing in the world, which I think hurt her more than the money did, honestly. I don't see her often. We are not estranged in the dramatic cinematic sense. She comes to Emma's birthday parties, she sends cards, but the version of our relationship where I needed her approval, where I organized my worth around what she decided to tell me I deserved, that version ended the morning I set a certified mail receipt on my father's old store counter and watched her realize I already knew. I still have that first envelope, the one with my name on it in my father's handwriting. I keep it in a drawer in my home office, not because I need the reminder of what my family did, but because I need the reminder of what my father did. He didn't fight for me loudly. He didn't leave some dramatic deathbed confession or force a confrontation he wasn't going to be alive to see through. He built me a quiet, patient trail of proof and trusted that I would follow it when I was ready, the same way he trusted me my whole life to ask the right questions, to notice the details, to be the one who asked how the business was actually doing instead of how much it was worth. I think about that sentence almost every day now. You're the only one who ever asks me how the business is actually doing instead of how much it's worth. I didn't understand, sitting in his office 6 weeks before he died, that he was telling me something about the future, about a filing cabinet in a storage unit 40 minutes outside the city, about a letter that would sit unread for 3 years until a $10 late fee finally found its way to my mailbox. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for a dramatic reckoning, a courtroom scene, a shouting match, a moment where the truth arrives with thunder behind it. Mine arrived in a stack of paper on a store counter on a quiet Sunday morning, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Because the truth, when you finally have it in your hands, documented and dated and undeniable, doesn't need to be loud. Just needs to be true. There's a photograph I keep on my desk now, one I found in that wooden chest alongside the ledger and the letter, of my father standing in front of the very first store. The one on 5th Street, the year it opened, decades before I was born. He's younger than I am now in that picture, grinning, sleeves rolled up, one hand resting on a hand-painted sign that still hangs in the stockroom today because I refuse to let anyone throw it away. I think about him a lot, standing there at the beginning of something he had no way of knowing would one day need protecting from his own family. I think about how much foresight it must have taken, how much quiet heartbreak, to watch the people closest to you shift and calculate around your money while you were still alive to see it, and to respond not with confrontation but with patience, with paperwork, with trust placed carefully in the one person you believed would eventually go looking. Emma is 5 now. She doesn't know the whole story yet, not really, though she knows her grandfather built the stores and that one of them has his name still painted faintly under a newer sign out front, because I asked the sign company to leave it there when we redid the storefront last year. Someday I'll tell her the rest of it, not as a story about betrayal, but as a story about what it looks like when someone quietly refuses to let the people they love be erased, even after they're gone. I'll tell her that the truth doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to. Sometimes it arrives in a parking ticket. Sometimes it takes 3 years. But if you're patient, and if you're willing to look closely at the things that don't quite add up instead of looking away from them, it arrives. My father knew that. He'd always known that. And in the end, so did I.